Senior Trump administration officials met with their Chinese counterparts in London today in an effort to strike a deal between the world's two largest economies.
Welcome back. Top officials from both the U.S. and China are meeting in London right now to diffuse some of the tension caused.
So the U.S. actually, to produce these high-end chips that it's now embargoing to go to China, is dependent on importing all these rare earth metals from China.
Just weeks later, the White House scrambled to walk them back down to 30%. But for millions of Americans, the damage had already landed in the form of higher prices at checkout lanes, emptier shelves, and more stress on already stretched family budgets. According to Yahoo Finance and Energy Connects, the tariff surge added an average of $1,200 in extra annual costs per household. That's not about yachts or iPhones. It's diapers, batteries, appliances, and brake pads, items that everyday Americans rely on. What was promised as leverage quickly turned into a hidden tax one that no one voted for, but everyone is paying. Then came the second blow. In April, China retaliated. Rare earth exports, the lifeblood of America's defense and tech industries, dropped 37% year over year, according to WSJ and Energy Connects. These aren't just exotic metals, they're the critical ingredients for missiles, smartphones, electric vehicles, and wind turbines. Without them, the USDs can't build it, can't compete. Ford Motor Company, one of the nation's industrial pillars, felt the sting almost immediately. A production line was shut down not due to demand or labor disputes, but because China's clampdown on exports choked the supply of rare earth magnets components used in engines, brakes, and steering systems. The factory floor didn't fall silent from recession. It froze because the raw materials simply weren't there. This wasn't strength. It wasn't strategic. It was self-sabotage wrapped in patriotic slogans. The very tariffs that were supposed to punish Beijing were now punishing Detroit, Phoenix, and Peoria.
The truth is now getting out there about electric vehicles.
And this was just the beginning. Now, just months after launching the most aggressive tariff wave in U.S. history, Donald Trump is back at the microphone this time with a smile and a soft tone. He says he's had a very good talk with President Xi Jinping. He claims a new agreement is in the works. The headlines say China will resume rare earth exports to the U.S. and that a deal is very far advanced. But look past the press conference, and what you see isn't a breakthrough, it's damage control. According to reports from the Wall Street Journal and Yahoo Finance, China has agreed only to restart limited shipments under a 6-month export license program, not a full reopening of the rare earth pipeline. Every shipment will now require strict approval from Beijing. Every use of those minerals will be scrutinized, especially if they're destined for military or high-tech manufacturing in the U.S. This isn't a win, it's a temporary fix wrapped in red tape. In other words, China didn't lift the curtain, it tightened the leash. Trade analysts are already warning this deal doesn't reduce America's dependency, it just gives the illusion of progress. As one former U.S. official put it, Beijing's move is strategic. It gives just enough to lower tensions, but not enough to give up control. The monopoly may have loosened slightly, but the power still lies firmly in China's hands.
We're highly dependent on China. I mean, consider that we don't have any heavy rare earth processing facilities here at home.
And Trump, he's calling it a success, not because it truly solves the crisis, but because he needs something, anything to point to as a victory. But for U.S. businesses and factories, this isn't clarity. It's confusion disguised as compromise. This is not economic strength. It's a retreat dressed up as diplomacy, and everyone at the negotiating table knows it.
Reducing tariffs and allowing certain elements.
It all began on April 2, 2025, the day some in Washington called Liberation Day. That morning, Donald Trump signed off on a sweeping tariff hike, slapping Chinese imports with duties that climbed as high as 145%. It was meant to be a show of strength, a decisive blow meant to liberate American industry from Chinese dependence. But Beijing didn't flinch. Within hours, China fired back, matching the tariffs and adding their own twists targeting sensitive U.S. exports, slowing customs clearances, and most damaging of all, quietly restricting the flow of critical materials like rare earth minerals. What was pitched as an economic strike turned into a two-way disaster. By late April, the consequences were no longer abstract. According to the Washington Post, U.S. households were projected to pay an additional $3,800 a year in higher costs. Not for luxuries, but for essentials: clothing, electronics, groceries, and car parts. The inflation spike wasn't theoretical. It hit families where it hurt most, at the checkout line. And behind the scenes, America's business world went into panic mode. At major companies like Walmart, Ford, and Best Buy, executives rushed to set up internal war rooms to respond to the chaos. Inventory shortages, rising costs, and supply chain meltdowns dominated boardroom meetings. What should have been a boom year became a survival exercise. Small businesses didn't even have time to plan. Importers who relied on Chinese goods found themselves priced out overnight. Retailers had to cancel orders. Manufacturers delayed production. Some simply shut their doors. The goal of this tariff war, according to Trump, was to bring jobs back and boost American strength. Instead, it paralyzed supply chains, fueled inflation, and forced U.S. firms into a corner. This wasn't economic liberation. It was economic whiplash. And it had only just begun. Then came the real blow. In retaliation for Trump's sweeping tariffs, China struck where it hurt most, not with more taxes, but with silence. In April 2025, Beijing quietly announced new restrictions on the export of 6 critical rare earth elements, the building blocks behind America's most advanced industries: electric vehicles, aerospace, and national defense. These weren't just obscure minerals. They were the core ingredients used in making precision-guided missiles, wind turbines, electric car motors, and even jet fighters. Without them, the machines stop. And that's exactly what started happening. According to Reuters, China controls between 90% to 95% of global refining and production of neodymium iron boron NdFeB magnets, tiny powerful components found in everything from Tesla drive units to F-35 fighter jets. When China cut back supply, the message was clear: they wouldn't need to escalate through noise. They'd just tighten the faucet. And in Detroit, assembly lines started to seize. The message traveled fast. When Ford halted its production line, it wasn't an isolated case. It was a warning shot. One that echoed from Detroit to drone factories in Nevada, from military suppliers in Arizona to electric bus plants in Georgia. And they weren't alone. Aerospace suppliers reported delays. Contractors tied to the U.S. military issued warnings. Even robotic manufacturers began flagging shortages. This wasn't just economic discomfort anymore, it was a strategic vulnerability, one that China didn't even have to shout about. They simply turned the dial, and the United States started choking on its own supply chain. What Trump had dismissed as a simple trade fight was turning into something far more dangerous: a national security risk. And China never had to fire a single shot. By early summer 2025, the impact of the trade war had moved far beyond press briefings and economic forecasts. Factories across the U.S. were stalling. Some paused production for days. Others slashed output by half. Assembly lines that once moved with precision were now paralyzed, waiting on parts that never arrived, or materials that had suddenly doubled in price. What began as a policy to bring jobs back was now threatening the very industries it aimed to protect. According to AP News, the U.S. economy contracted by 1.1 percentage points in projected GDP growth, and inflation jumped to 4.4%, fueled by supply chain chaos and skyrocketing input costs. American families felt it fast and hard. Depending on location and income, households were estimated to lose between $100 and $200 and $300 to $800 just from higher consumer prices and reduced purchasing power. Small businesses already operating on thin margins were crushed by rising costs, delayed shipments, and dwindling inventory. And across the country, thousands of workers were laid off, victims of a war that never reached the battlefield but bulldozed their livelihoods anyway. What was promised as patriotic protection had become a slow bleed from within. So how did it get this far? Because this wasn't strategy, it was ego. Trump had declared from the podium that trade wars are good and easy to win. But beneath the slogans, there was no real plan, no alternate suppliers, no national reserves, no fast track to replace China's dominance in key sectors. So when Beijing responded not with bluster, but with licensing restrictions and controlled exports, the U.S. was caught off guard. According to the Wall Street Journal, there was no emergency stockpile of rare earth materials, no clear alternative for critical minerals. American industries had been left exposed not by foreign sabotage, but by a lack of preparation. The result, the U.S. found itself cornered, scrambling to undo damage it had inflicted on itself. And the only way out, ironically, was to go back to the negotiating table with the very country it tried to weaken. This wasn't a tactical setback. It was a national wake-up call delivered through soaring prices, silent assembly lines, and pink slips. Now, months after triggering a global supply chain shock, the U.S. has landed in a strange place. Not at war, not at peace, but somewhere in between. The so-called deal that Trump announced in June isn't a breakthrough. It's a temporary patch designed more to calm markets than to change reality. Yes, China agreed to resume some rare earth shipments, but only through a limited, tightly controlled export licensing system, one that gives Beijing full visibility and veto power over what goes where. The power dynamic hasn't shifted, it's just been paused. And for many watching closely, this isn't a victory, it's a silent retreat. What the public sees is a smiling president thanking Xi Jinping for restarting supplies. But what trade analysts see is a U.S. president quietly pleading for access to the very resources he once believed tariffs could replace. It's not about showing strength anymore. It's about containing the fallout from a crisis that could have been prevented. There is a path forward, but it's long, expensive, and uncertain. The U.S. and its allies have begun laying the foundation for an alternative supply chain. Investments are pouring into companies like MP Materials in Texas, and exploration partnerships have expanded to Canada, Australia, and even Saudi Arabia, as reported by WSJ and The Verge. The goal: to reduce dependency on China by rebuilding the entire rare earth ecosystem from scratch. At the same time, major automakers like BMW and Renault are racing to redesign electric motors that don't require NdFeB magnets, one of China's tightest choke points. According to Reuters, these rare earth-free alternatives could become game changers, but for now they remain in early testing stages. That's the reality. America is trying to rebuild a bridge that should have never been burned. But the blueprint isn't finished. The materials are scarce and the deadline is unknown. The shift will take years, not months. Billions in funding, global coordination, and above all, political discipline, the kind that prioritizes long-term resilience over short-term headlines. The trade war was launched with bold talk and big promises, but there was no backup plan. And when the counterattack came, not with missiles, but with minerals, America's vulnerabilities were laid bare. The result: a supply chain in crisis, prices out of control, a nation forced to beg for what it once assumed it could dominate. What Trump calls a deal is really a delay. The U.S. may be scrambling to recover supplies, but the leverage still sits in Beijing. And unless there's real strategic investment coordination with allies and technological reinvention, that grip won't loosen anytime soon. This was never about toughness. It was about preparation, and America wasn't ready. The next chapter won't be written with slogans. It'll be written with steel science and patience.